Hello and welcome to today's event brought to you by Euractiv, supported by Shinogi on EU health security. I'm Jennifer Baker and I will be your moderator this afternoon. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, EU and national governments recognise the need to work together on a greater policy infrastructure to be better prepared for future cross-border health security threats. Now, we're going to ask today how much of that has translated into practice. How prepared is Europe? Because, of course, while in the public domain and in layperson terms we may become a little bit complacent, there is still a real need to get something done. And in 2022, the European Commission introduced a regulation to develop a comprehensive prevention, preparedness and response plan at EU member state level. And of course, on a global level, we have seen some movement in the World Health Organization as well. Now, pandemics, of course, they've not gone away. We need to be prepared, but we're also seeing a slow pandemic of AMR, antimicrobial resistance. So we're going to talk about that as well, because again, this is a condition that knows no borders and we need to be prepared and working together on that. So we have a great lineup of speakers. If you've been registered for a while, you may have seen some last minute changes, but we have also joining us online from 5 o'clock as well, Thomas Lav, MEP and member of the Sant Committee, will join us for the latter half of the debate. But I'm delighted to have also online joining us Antonio Parenti, Director Public Health, Cancer and Security within DG Sante in the European Commission. Thank you very much, Antonio. Here in the room we have Laurent Michel, Deputy Head of HERA from the European Commission. We have also got Emmanuel André, Co-Chair of the Advisory Committee on Public Health Emergencies, European Commission, and also Professor of Clinical Microbiology in KU Leuven and a medical doctor. Rohit Malpani is Senior Policy Advisor at the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership. And finally, we have Hugh Tippett, who is CEO of Shinogi Europe. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. We'll start online, Antonio, with you. So I'll ask you just to set the scene. I mentioned that, of course, the European Commission has taken some steps, but tell us a little bit about where we're at and what is the general landscape at the moment. Antonio? I'm going to guess we have some issues with the sound. Can we hear you, Antonio?
No, can you hear me?
We can indeed. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I thought I would have been unmuted directly. Sorry for the picture, but there's some issue of bandwidth here. Well, you mentioned already from the start Regulation 2371/2022, which has been the major you could say, result of the thinking about COVID, about regulation, the establishment of ERA, the strengthened mandate of the CDC. We now have a situation, a backbone of our preparedness, very established in the EU. So we are in a much better situation than we were years ago. And DG Sante is clearly intensifying collaboration with the all relevant key partners to be able to sharpen our rapid reaction capacity. Of course, we are in a better situation, we are better prepared, we are doing a lot of efforts to remain abreast of any possible changes, but there are also growing challenges. One of these, for example, is antimicrobial resistance, and we all know how dreadful is and dreadful is the result. Every year there is more death linked to MAR than to influenza, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS combined. So we are with our One Health approach and with our EU for Health program launched the largest EU-funded action against AMR. So we have, if you want, a situation which has evolved, as I said, which put us in a much better situation, a much more coordinated situation, both within the European Commission and with member states. Of course, health remains a national competence, so for us it remains also incredibly important to ensure interoperability, funding capacity building, and a coordinated approach and action through our mandatory reporting and assessment. And I think that's where we are doing it. That's what we are, what we will continue to do, bridging national sovereignty and a EU secure-wide demand both, which demands both financial muscles and political will, makes the EU today ready to deserve better its 150 million citizens.
Thank you, Antonio. We will try not to say over and over, health is a national competency. I fear we might get into a loop with that today, but we're going to look at what happens at EU level. So, Laurent, turning to you, give us an outline of what you're working on, what your focus is.
Yes, thank you. Well, health is a national competence, but during COVID-19, you have seen that it was us at the European Commission who negotiated the COVID-19 contracts. We ensured the answer at European level and also coordinated the measures that were taken to ensure the transportation of the goods, to maintain the single European market, to maintain our economy alive. So I think we have a lot of competence at European level. And in fact, ERA has been created during COVID times to answer to the crisis. It was a lesson learned from the COVID-19 that we were missing a body to coordinate on the medical countermeasures. So our focus is really to ensure that we have the right medical countermeasures when needed and in sufficient numbers, because you can have the prototype vaccine, but if you have no surge capacity, no scale of production, then you still don't solve the crisis. So what we are doing is very simple, actually. We are looking at pathogen by pathogens, pathogen with high pandemic potential. So we are looking at, we have identified 12 viral families. We are looking whether we have diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccine for this family of pathogens, and where are the missing gaps. And we are trying to support the development of medical countermeasures if there is a gap. And we are looking also at ensuring that we have sufficient production capacity in Europe in case of crisis. That's basically what we're doing. Of course, we're also working on the AMR file and trying to develop new class of antibiotics, but that's another story that I'm sure Garpi will discuss a bit later. That's what we are doing in a nutshell. So whether we are better prepared or not, I think we still have many gaps and we also have to look at the different platform technologies, because sometimes you believe you have a solution, but it will not work when the pathogen will mutate. So we have to be sure also that we have also sufficient different technologies available, so not rely only put all our eggs into the mRNA basket, for instance, but look at all the different technologies. So that's what we are doing in ERA. And to give a concrete example where we are better prepared is that we have now protocol in place, we are contract in place, we are much more reactive. And for instance, during the Mpox crisis that started on the 15th of August last year, when WHO and Africa CDC declared an international emergency and public health emergency international public health emergency. We were 2 weeks later available, ready to deploy vaccine, and I was in Kinshasa 2 weeks later delivering 200,000 vaccines that we had contracted with a European producer. They were ready to be used, ready to be deployed. So we are much faster, much more reactive. So that's one of the result of COVID-19, the positive result.
Well, we take lessons learned. So Emmanuel, as co-chair of the Advisory Committee on Public Health Emergencies, presumably you would like to put yourself out of a job and have no emergencies at all, because prevention would be great, but preparedness is also very important. So tell me what your focus is.
So maybe before that, I would like to mention a bit my daily experience as a medical doctor here in Belgium. As in every other European country and around the world, we're facing on a daily basis patients infected with bacteria which are resistant to the antibiotics we have in the clinic. And this, as you mentioned, is a daily issue, and we're spending today a lot of resources to try to treat these patients, and not enough to prepare in advance for the future threats. And indeed, as you mentioned, there are two types of threats. The one, on one side, AMR, which is something that has been rising for decades, on which we haven't been able to anticipate, despite the fact that the signals are there since quite a long time. And on the other side, there are all these viral families that Laurent just mentioned, which have the potential to create new crises as we see popping up. And to work on these aspects, next to the clinical work, there's also this role of surveillance of disease, understanding the epidemiology. And so another side of my job is to provide all these efforts to increase the surveillance and outreach towards global health diplomacy, but also at the national and EU level, to try to strengthen all these links that we should maintain. And finally, we need to reinforce the pipeline and the core facilities, not only the funding core facilities, but also the technical core facilities, to be able to streamline a number of development programs. And for that, we need to create the right ecosystem. We need to be ambitious. And that's leading me to the last part, which is my role as co-chair of this new advisory committee on public health emergencies, where the EU has decided to create this group of 50 experts coming from different backgrounds, different countries in the EU, with the aim to provide advice in the case of public health emergencies, to help take the decision of the declaration of a public health emergency, but also to advise on the measures that we need to take. And that role is obviously massively important in times of crisis, but it is also important to have continued work to make sure that we're prepared as much as we can to face these public health emergencies that will arrive.
I'll be coming back to that interesting point about monitoring and tracking as well as part of preparedness. Rohit, tell us what you're working on. I mean, Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, I'm sure many have heard of it, but perhaps you could give us a bit more background.
Sure, and thank you for inviting us to be here. About a decade ago, there was a consensus internationally, both at the World Health Organization and the United Nations, about the threat of AMR. And a few years after that, the WHO and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative founded GARDP, which is a not-for-profit partnership that focuses on the development and access of new and existing antibiotics for what we think are the most urgent needs that are defined by the WHO and by governments. And we work through collaborations with the public, private, and not-for-profit sector. Some of our most important partners are here on stage. We have an agreement and a deepening collaboration with Shionogi for ensuring access to a new antibiotic known as cefiderocol. And HERA is actually one of GARDP's most important funders and thought partners. So that sort of illustrates the importance from our perspective of working with partners to achieve our goals. And we're primarily focused on serious bacterial infections and sexually transmitted infections. And again, with an eye towards the global needs, but especially trying to ensure that the needs, especially of low and middle income countries and of vulnerable populations, especially children and babies, are not left behind, because that's ultimately where most of the burden and impact of AMR is being felt today and will continue to be felt in the future.
Hugh, we'll come to you for the last in the round of openings, because as you know, one of the co-sponsors of today's event, Shionogi wants to be part of the conversation, part of the mix. Tell us why that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's AMR or pandemic preparedness, actually there's a very good framework, the 100-day mission, which was recently adopted by the WHO and the IPPS and the G7 as well. I think it's a very good framework, actually, for what needs to happen. So what are the elements of that framework? Well, number one's already been said. You really need an active R&D pipeline, a really vibrant R&D pipeline. And I was last in this sector in the 1990s, where that was a huge decade of innovation then. We need to have the same again, really. We need to attract people back to the sector, in science, in universities, in hospitals, and make it as important as oncology or immunotherapy today. I think that's what we need. And when you meet people in the space, they're so committed to it, it's a great place to be. So that's the first thing. We need a range of medical countermeasures, spanning, the whole spectrum that's needed. If it's a pandemic, clearly vaccines are really the answer. But the 100-day piece is that piece before vaccines become available. So I think, therapeutics have a very important role to play there. And we've learned a lot from COVID-19 with that. How do you make all that happen? Funding is going to be critical, and you need innovative funding mechanisms for that. Actually, I'll switch to AMR for a moment because that's the space that I'm in today with our company. And I think the marketplace, it's as challenging as I've ever seen it today. Why is that? Well, if you're an antibiotic manufacturer today, like most medicines, you get reimbursed on the amount of medicines that you sell. Well, that's a problem with infectious disease because typically the courses are very short in duration, maybe 10 to 12 days, unlike chronic therapies. That's the first challenge you have in terms of monetizing the medicine. And the second thing is that, the anti-infectives that we have, we want to conserve them. Stewardship's really important, so we've got a societal responsibility to that. So that makes it additionally challenging for a manufacturer. So I think innovative mechanisms, in the last 4 years, I spent a lot of time with that, with my company, actually learning about that, working very closely with stakeholders and finding new innovative funding mechanisms. So I think we need to work really hard at that one to make it all work. And the last thing, I've kind of already said it, is that it's cross society. We need the whole range of people involved with it, from governments and policymakers, health experts, GARD-P, the relationship we have with GARD-P. What I heard there, Rohit, you said about those people most vulnerable actually are in low and middle income countries. So we're very proud in Shinogi to have signed that agreement with you that make our medicine available in those countries in the shortest time possible. So access to medicine is is important.
Well, impossible for some,
Impossible
which is
and
indeed the
important,
problem. Well, thank you very much. So that's a good round to set the stage for us, so we know where everyone is focused on. And a lot of things you won't hear any arguments about today. We're going to continue our conversation, but I want to remind everyone in the room, we want your questions as well as your questions online. For those joining online, you can simply type it into the box on your right. For those here in the room, you can scan that QR code. You'll find it there on the big screen as well as on places around the room, and they will be transferred to me, and we'll try to get through as many as possible to our speakers in the 1.5 hours that we have, a little bit less now. Rohit, let me come back to you then. You said you work on a sort of global level, but let's look on the EU initiatives on cross-border health threats. How can they be effectively implemented? Because we've heard a little bit from the Commission side, there are good ideas. Implementation is also important. Tell us your thoughts on that at both EU and national level.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first answer I'd give is maybe not disagreeing with that, but saying I think the lesson of COVID-19, and certainly the lesson we see today, is it is important, obviously, for the EU to have strong coordination internally, but it is also important for cross-border to be global. Ultimately, what we know is that we have to address pandemic threats, emerging resistance where it is occurring, and that means that for the EU, what's required is being able to work collaboratively with other countries and to be able to coordinate as much as possible and to be able to ensure that the resources of all countries are being brought together to be able to address these threats as effectively as possible. And I think it's a credit to the European Union that has often tried to do that. So that would be the first thing. The second is just the active role that the EU has to take. So, as we say, we want to avoid this discussion about what is a national competency versus a global competency. But this isn't something that any one actor can deal with. So what we see as GARD-P is we work through all these different partnerships. It's very difficult to bring them together to achieve a result. But when you're talking about the development of an antibiotic on an end-to-end basis and ensuring that it can be sustained over time and used appropriately, it requires that direction. And I think, the emergence of HERA has been an important factor in ensuring that can be done on a planned level. And then the third is just to ensure that we're planning for access as early as possible. It can be possible, it can be impossible, but the earlier that you address it, the more you think about it up front, and the more you plan for it, you can avoid all the things that we see with antibiotics today that are a problem. Antibiotics aren't getting registered. We have shortages occurring in countries around the world. They can sometimes be unaffordable. We don't have the evidence and data to ensure that they can be used. These are all things that need to be planned as early as possible. We don't have the evidence so that providers can actually make good use of them in different networks around the world. So I think those are the things that we would say have to be done as effectively as possible.
Antonio, let me bring you back in again as well to maybe talk a bit about how the EU measures that have been proposed and that are in effect work as part of a global jigsaw, and how important is that for you inside of DG Sante and the Commission?
Well, we are, if to a large extent, at the center of this system, and what we are now trying to enhance, if you want, is coordination and interoperability, because those are elements. You can hear me, right?
More or less, we're missing the odd word, but persevere. I think we're getting the understanding.
I'm very sorry. Actually, I'm Nico on my side. No, what is really important is maintaining interoperability and assure, of course, coordination. This also goes with the member states. So we are spending a fair amount of resources in assuring that what we are preparing at European level can be interoperable with member states. We are also spending a lot of time at the moment starting to develop scenarios and be ready for different type of scenarios. And those are, of course, of medical nature, but it can also be of human nature and human interpretation. Of course, the geopolitical situation is quite changing in the recent times, so we have to take into consideration these and be ready and be prepared for that. So we are working, if you want, through our mandatory reporting by member states and assessment of national prevention to put in place an effective impact assessment and impact of our actions.
Thank you. Let me come back again, Emmanuel, to you. You were talking about working day to day in the hospital, but you also talked about tracking and monitoring, which is obviously a global thing. How much time, how much effort, and how important is that element of really knowing what is likely to come through the doors to you?
Well, let's put ourselves in a scenario of a public health emergency with a new virus popping up. I think everybody can remind that. Not being prepared and waiting for 100 days, the 100-day mission that we speak that we discuss about when we speak about vaccines. These 100 days are a medical disaster, a societal, economic disaster, but also potentially a political issue. And the waiting time is very difficult. So the only way we have is to go and fetch these viruses and understand their phylogeny. That means what is their common root that we can tackle and for which we can prepare with antivirals, for example. We need to monitor how drug-resistant bacteria evolve in different hospitals. We know that in Europe, different countries are affected differently by these organisms. In Africa, in Asia, the situation might be very different too. And we need to understand the drivers that lead to the spread of all these organisms. If we are not able to do that, we cannot prepare in terms of having the right tools, medical countermeasures, but also all the prevention strategies that we should be able to implement. So the intelligence, the baseline is the epidemiological intelligence, but also the fundamental research, our ability to study these organisms. And this is something that happens in the academia, in the research labs, which tend now these days to be more and more involved, not only in the fundamental research, but also play a societal role by bringing solutions towards the society and linking with the private sector to try to translate their understanding, their knowledge, innovations into commercialized products.
Well, this, Laurent, was one thing I wanted to ask of you as well. So who needs to be in the mix when we're having these conversations? I mean, obviously, you've got, as you say, the research labs, the hospitals, the public health authorities. But the private sector does have to be involved somewhere along the line. During the COVID pandemic, we all became very familiar with PPE, which I'm sure many of the general public had never heard of before. And suddenly you have textile factories who are in the mix as having to scale up. How do you sort of steward that or coordinate that, Laurent?
Well, I think in the mix, you need to have, of course, the producer at the end of the day. But what we are insisting on, we'll have a strategy on medical countermeasures that should be adopted by the Commission early July. So we will have all the details. But what we are looking at is an end-to-end approach from fundamental research in academia up to production and stockpiling. So we need that end-to-end approach. And the 100-day mission should not be a 100-day mission. We should have on day one diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines that are working. It's not going to be the case, so that's why we have put this objective for 100 days. But at least when a crisis hits us, we need to have some form of solutions. Maybe not the perfect therapeutic, maybe not the perfect vaccine, but we need to have some medical countermeasures available. And that's what we are working on.
Well, the same question, Hugh, to you. I mean, how important is it that everyone is around the table when we're making these plans for the future?
It's absolutely critical. It's so important. Yeah, no, it really is. And I was listening to all the colleagues on the panel about the elements in there. I mean, speaking from an industry point of view, I mean, the last data I saw for anti-infectives from the World Health Authority was approximately 28 products, in phase 3, so in final development there. That's not many, right, for the 5 most critical World Health designated pathogens in the world, because of very high failure rates in clinical development of antimicrobials. Why? Because actually you're developing a product that has to be lethal to pathogens and safe in human use. So actually that's why it's a high failure rate. So like I said earlier, we need many, many more players coming back to the space. I mean, many companies have left the space. We need to attract them back. I happen to represent a company 140-year-old Japanese company who's been in the space for 70 years and is very committed to it, antivirals and antibiotics. And actually just this week we got very good news about a new oral antifungal in phase 3 development. So we'll be able to continue that development program. That's like a big flag event for us. And we have a range of other antivirals being developed for the future. So again, it's about, I think, having this whole range of medical countermeasures available, which we discuss with the policymakers. Of course, the other thing about that first 100 days to be prepared for it comes back to the funding as well. You have to have some level of stockpiling. And stockpiling is a challenging question, I know, for governments and Lauren, for HERO as well. So again, we have to find an innovative way, some kind of insurance model that makes that work for all sides. And we found we can do that with anti-infectives. We've done that in many countries today. And, we're prepared to put our shoulder to the wheel to have those kind of discussions.
I see a couple of questions coming in on funding already, so we'll do a round of that in a moment. But let me ask Roy, another question that's come in from the audience is, what are the gaps that exist in the coordination and real-time data sharing among EU agencies and member states during rapidly evolving natural hazard-induced health emergencies? I think actually, Emmanuel, that might be more for you. Where are the gaps in real-time data sharing? Are there gaps? Perhaps there are none.
No. So there are a number of communication channels which have been put in place and that we need to acknowledge. The EU system has facilitated and structurally the exchange of information. So we have the ECDC, which plays a massive role in disease surveillance. We have a number of places and research consortia where researchers from different countries are able to exchange information. But still, what we are facing now, and I'm starting once again from the surveillance perspective, when we first identified the new samples, is our ability to share biological samples between countries. That requires a lot of administration and paperwork that can delay the whole process. And in the context of the COVID, for example, a number of top European research institutes have been able to overcome all these issues with the support of HERA to facilitate the research. And we see that when we can overcome and anticipate on these challenges, then the research can be very rapid and very efficient. So there are some gaps today, but there's a lot of work that can be done in advance to facilitate all these exchanges.
Yeah. No.
Yes, I fully agree with Emmanuel. I think it's not really the issue. I mean, the sharing of information between member states and at European level is working well. We have ECDC as mentioned. We have the early warning system where member states are informing us when there's something happening. So we have the tool in place in terms of information. What is more problematic is to get information from other parts of the world. And we remember the story with China and COVID-19, and we might have an emergence of a virus or pathogen, an outbreak, and the authorities will not inform us because they are afraid of, flight cancellation, closure of the border, and so on. So that's what is more challenging is with other parts of the world, including the United States at the moment, where they cut down the staff in US CDC, and they have a massive, well, let's not call it massive, but they have an outbreak of avian flu in the United States, and it's difficult to have a full picture on the evolution of the outbreak. So we have some information gaps elsewhere, but at European level, I don't think that is the main challenge at the moment. We have made a lot of progress on that front.
Well, let's take this question of the EU and the global communication, but global supply chains are also a question as well, Laurent. Is that something you're wrestling with?
Yes, I mean, together with DG Santé, we have been working on supply chain. DG Santé has put forward, I mean, Commissioner Varela has put forward the Critical Medicine Act. We are looking at it from a MCM perspective, a supply chain, and we need to ensure that we are not vulnerable. So we do vulnerability assessment. And on that basis, it doesn't mean that everything needs to be reshore in Europe, but we need to avoid that we are relying on only one partner and one factory in that country. And so reshoring is part of what we are looking at, making sure that we have the production in Europe, but we are looking also at partnership with reliable partner, diversification of our supply. And for instance, Japan is considered as a reliable partner, and we are also discussing with different countries to ensure that we have a secure supply chain.
So I see we have joined us online MEP Thomas Lav, who is a member of the Sant Committee in the European Parliament. Thomas Lav, lovely to see you. We're discussing the various issues that I know you've been briefed on. So tell us what the focus is for you as a parliamentarian for the Sant Committee in looking at preparedness for a future pandemic or for things like AMR.
Thank you very much. So a lot of questions in one question. So obviously we already did a lot during the pandemic. So we created HERA, we created the regulation of cross-border health threats with joint procurement of medical countermeasures, etc. So a lot of things have already been done. Obviously now the focus is on Critical Medicines Act, and you probably know that I was appointed as rapporteur recently on the CMA, and for us that's definitely the first priority now. When we speak about the CMA, so the whole idea is that we increase, as was already said by Mr. Michel, the security of supply chains, that we reduce dependencies on suppliers from outside Europe, and especially in cases where we are dependent on only one supplier. And that's the biggest problem usually in the area of generic medicines, antibiotics, etc. So I think that the approach is good. This is something that the EPP advocated for, that we
Thomas Lav, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think something has happened and you've suddenly gone mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great.
Okay. So I don't know what was the last part that you heard, but anyway, so this idea that price in public procurement is not the only criterion, so the lowest price, but that we also take into account security of supply chains, and that we can give preference to those producers who produce medicines in Europe. So by doing that, we are incentivizing companies to invest in Europe, to build production sites in Europe. We also provide some additional rules on faster permitting. So the idea that permits and all the necessary paperwork is done faster, so that new production sites can be built in Europe as well. So that's obviously the main, I would say, the main part and most important part of the CMA. One area where I think there is room for improvement on the CMA is the question of stockpiling. Because you know that during the pandemic, for instance, the problem of national stockpiles, which are kept for themselves, even though there is maybe a bigger need in another member state, that has caused problems. And recently, executive director of the EMA said in the hearing in the Sant Committee in the European Parliament that one of the underlying causes for shortages is national stockpiling. So what I will propose as the rapporteur will be to create and strengthen the common European system of stockpiling in a way that we have common European coordination of stockpiles, and that in case there is, for instance, shortage of an antibiotic in Greece or in Bulgaria, and we have this antibiotic on stockpile in France or in Italy, for instance, then European centralized decision can be made to allocate and send these medicines from the stockpile in one member state to the area where we have the shortage. Of course, this will retain some. This will mean some changes in the legislative proposal, but the idea is to create common European system of knowing the stockpiles, knowing the system all the time, so where each medicine is placed, but also what is crucial, having a centralized decision-making process about where to allocate necessary medicines in case of shortage, and definitely we envisage a very strong role for HERA in that process. Also on antimicrobial, so that's I think the most important things in the CMA. So European preference, joint procurement, taking into account security of supply chain, stimulating production in Europe, one big part, and the second part which needs improvement and upgrading is the part of stockpiling to create a common European system of coordination of stockpiles. And on antimicrobial resistance that you mentioned, we are doing something now on that in the general pharmaceutical legislation. You probably know that now we have the council position finally, so we can start negotiations on this file next week between the parliament and the council. And here, obviously, the stimulation of production of antimicrobials will be essential. I'm glad that both the council and the parliament have retained the voucher as an incentive for production and development of new antimicrobials. Both parliament and the council add some additional conditions on the use of voucher, but the idea is that this voucher is used and for rewarding those companies which actually finalize the product and get the product to the new product to the patients. Because we know that for antimicrobials we have market failure, that we don't have a business case currently for companies to develop new antimicrobials. So by providing these incentives through the voucher, I think that we can make progress there. Also, the parliament has some additional provisions, some additional incentives like milestone payments for development of new antimicrobials. Of course, we still have to find a budget for that, but I think that if we say that this is one of the priorities, that having developing new antimicrobials is one of the priorities, that definitely we can also find the money in the budget there as well. So I think, in terms of regulation, I think these are two most important things. But in general, the whole concept of focusing on bringing investments to Europe, strengthening our competitiveness, will definitely make us also, we hope, less dependent on the others as well.
Thank you. You also covered a lot of ground, Thomas Lav, in your opening remarks there. But you went some way to addressing one of the questions I see coming in from Dr. Nick Darabos, is asking how resilient are the EU's medical supply chains and stockpiles to disruptions caused by concurrent national disasters, and what vulnerabilities remain. Emmanuel, would you like to tackle that one? Where do you see vulnerabilities?
Well, the reason why we create stockpiles is that we know that we are vulnerable. And what we have observed between the different European countries is that the lists of products which are stockpiled is something which is kept secret because it's a matter of course, national security. So changing and evolving in the direction of a shared stockpiling system is of course, going in the right direction. But we also know that if we empty our stockpile to donate it to other countries. Of course, this is the purpose of solidarity. And in terms of acute crisis, this makes a lot of sense. I would understand that some countries would be more hesitant to deliver their stockpiles of last resort antibiotics to a country which is facing an uncontrolled spread of multi-drug resistant organisms, because that means that the lifetime of that particular antibiotic is going to decrease with its use in a context which apparently is an uncontrolled context. So there will be a lot of debate every time, and so that's the reason why we need to reinforce all the chains, all the pipelines that feed new products, that control, that allow to better prevent, control, treat these infections. So the more tools we will have available, the more fluidic will be these stockpiles in the EU level, but also at global level.
Rohit, let me ask you to sort of expand a little bit on this question of, stockpiling preparedness on one side and potential hoarding on the other. I mean, is there a balance that can be struck, and what as Emmanuel used the word solidarity, what is the right approach? But not even just solidarity, but also that, you know, a safe world makes us all safer within it?
Sure. I mean, so the reality is, you know, we have to be honest about what happened in the COVID pandemic, and we have to be, as somebody who was working on it more from, at that time, on the perspective of low and middle income countries, that didn't work out very well, and I think that also came back to harm ultimately everyone around the world. But I don't think that we have to be stuck in this zero-sum game. I think that the concern is going to be that every country is just going to focus on what they can do to strengthen their own needs and to address their own shortages and their own supply capacity problems. In our experience, and I can just speak to GARD-P, when we think about the partnership that we've signed with Shionogi in order to ensure or to expand access to cefiderocol globally, you know, we're trying to work now with manufacturers in India. And that provides benefits not just to countries around the world, but actually can come back to provide benefits to Shionogi also for the countries that it's supplying. So the challenge is going to be how to get out of this idea of having a zero-sum game between focusing on the needs of each, and not just Europe, but everyone, but also just seeing like where they can work more broadly and how we can build better trust, as I think Laurent was saying, in terms of other trusted countries. I think there are, sure, some countries that you can point to, but arguably it should be able to be done on a much wider basis. I think the pandemic treaty for the WHO is like a first step in that direction, but if we're honest about it, that it's just words on a paper. It's ultimately going to require a lot more sort of contractual and bilateral relationships in order to make that work in practice.
Antonio, I'm going to bring you back in a little bit on this point as well. And I see we have a question from Bertrand Audouin, who is asking what kind of impacts do or will the recent changes in priorities on health at international level, so for example, decreased World Health Organization and UN AIDS budgets, US aid budgets, will that have any impact on EU health security's role and priorities? And if so, what? Or do we carry on regardless?
Well, it's Laurent was replying to a certain extent to this before. We have seen certainly a pattern which is, of course, worrying, because we see a decrease in attention or potential attention, for example, in the United States. At the same time, in the recent years, we have very much strengthened our position in Europe. We have a much more a much stronger ECDC, which can certainly take over a lot of these activities that before we were, to a certain extent, devoting or devolving to other organisms like the WHO. So, in that respect, I would not necessarily be particularly worried at European level. Of course, the problem is obtaining information from third parties and be able to process this information with the rapidity at a certain time are necessary for the type of threat that we could be facing. But the situation at international level could definitely ameliorate. While we ameliorate, we need to use the time to strengthen our position and our capacities in Europe, which is what I think we are doing at the moment. At the same time, also, maybe we come back to this later, with the development, with the signature of the pandemic agreement at the WHO, we are also making a step forward in putting other countries on alert and on the need for them to move in being better prepared and tackle before they start also the potential pandemic situations.
Thank you. Well, let's move on a little bit to questions around R&D. And I see Cynthia de Gelnick is asking, how can the EU be better at accelerating fundamental research to innovation or uptake by the private sector or healthcare professionals? Hugh, have you thoughts on how the EU could maybe better incentivize research, or are we already doing a great job? Nothing is perfect.
Well, there are two bits to the funding. That piece is push incentive. Right, so I think there's already activity there today. I think what we see on the other side of the pond, I think it represents a real opportunity for the EU, I think, and the EU is stepping up into that space. And, I think from an industry point of view, whether it's Shionogi or any other company in the space, we really welcome that today. For the reasons I said earlier, and we were all discussing about the failure rates of antibiotic development, 28 molecules in late stage for the most critical pathogens, it's not enough. We need much more of that. So the push incentives are definitely really key, and the different mechanisms need to be looked at. There is the other side as well, which is pull incentives once you're in the space. And I mentioned earlier about the challenges you have in monetizing, a new therapy to get a fair return on all that investment. And speaking personally, I've learned a lot in the last 4 years from launching our new antibiotic in Europe. So we're seeing new models emerge. I'll mention one just in passing. I think the UK actually has had a breakthrough in terms of what they call a decoupled deal. So it really so two parts of that. First of all, getting your medicine evaluated by NICE, so you understand the economic benefit you bring to the health system, and then having a reimbursement mechanism that supports that. So in this case, we took part in the pilot, and 2 companies were awarded a set amount of money, all right, which we get every year to make the medicine available. And that sort of gets around this problem, the fire extinguisher problem, right, of only using a product when you need it. So that's actually quite a clever way of reimbursing. We're seeing other models too. Italy have brought a model in just this year, actually changed the law in Italy to bring improved reimbursement for products that reach a certain level of innovation, and we've reached that level. That again attracts more people to the space. So all these things I think are useful. Different companies have different methods, but they all help bring more companies back into the space.
Laurent, I'm going to let you comment on that as well, because I see yet another person saying, Sonia Bloch saying, she's concerned that political attention is shifting to defence and security, and how can the EU sustain the momentum for funding for pandemic preparedness. So again, I guess some of these models Hugh's talking about are part of the way to do that.
Yes, definitely. Just to come back on stockpiling, because I think there was something missing, which is we have already in place a solidarity mechanism that is managed by EMA, the European Medicine Agency, through the MSSG. It's a bit of many acronyms. But when a member state is in need, it can request through that mechanism support from another member state. And it's a voluntary mechanism that has proven very effective the last 2 years since it is in place, notably during winter time. So we have that. And we have also a European stockpile built by ERA of 1.2 billion euros. This is a more strategic stockpile with specific products, notably medical countermeasures in case of cyber attacks or incidents that we have been building, and that is important. And that brings us to the next transition with a question on defense. I mean, it's true that defense is now really a top priority at European level, and we have experienced some cuts of budget on the health side to fund the defense side. But we have to show to the political level that health is health security, and that is part of defense. So that's what we are trying to do. We are working on civil-military cooperation, dual-use product. If you are investing on stockpiling of smallpox vaccine, you will deal with also defense and cyber products, but also protect from any natural event. So it's important to mix the two and to get the political level understand that a part of defense should be on health preparedness. So that's very important. Now on the question on research and development, we are doing a lot on push funding through Horizon Europe, notably. We have funding the new chikungunya vaccine, to give an example. I mean, and looking at climate change, and in this room, I can feel the climate change. Therefore, you excuse me. I took out my jacket. It's very warm, and I invite others to do it. But we are looking at funding, of course, based on our gap analysis. We are doing a push funding. We just issue a call for avian flu, for flu vaccine, new generation of flu vaccine, including avian flu. We just issue a call. We have just opened in May the European Vaccine Hub with 100 million euros, which will be really the coordination of the best research institute in Europe for vaccine development, so that they develop the prototype that we need. And you have in that vaccine hub the best in Europe to develop the product that we need. So we are doing a lot on push funding.
Rohit, yeah, I'm going to bring you in on this, and particularly the idea of implementing an end-to-end model for funding, so research, clinical development, manufacturing, and then access, which is sometimes forgotten at the end. Give us your thoughts on the funding models and what works.
Yeah, I mean, again, especially when we're talking about antibiotics, the use of an end-to-end model is critical, because otherwise you're hoping that you're going to get all the evidence and data produced that is required. You're hoping you're going to get the right formulation for a drug to ensure that it can be used, effectively and easily. And you're hoping that you're going to be able to get access to the drug where it's needed. And I think this comes a bit to the issues of push funding and pull incentives. Both are necessary. And I think the example of the UK is an important one, because it does provide, I think, for companies that have made these investments, a measure of recuperating their investments and a return on investment. The problem is that we start to get into this dynamic of believing that we only need pull incentives to solve our problems, and that will somehow go all the way back to the discovery phase and sort of solve all of our problems, and the market will eventually work again. And that's not the reality. I mean, when we look at the sort of opportunity cost of any company to invest in an antibiotic compared to what they are earning now in all the other areas, and we see with GLP-1s and with oncology, it's going to be very hard for a pull incentive to ever be able to compete with that. So we have to be able to have a way of marrying sort of these different types of push funding that can work on an end-to-end basis, and identifying where a pull incentive can be effective for companies that are making the investments. And I think the interesting thing with Shionogi is actually it developed cefiderocol without any pull incentive in mind. And part of that's because it's a company that actually develops, without sort of implying, a lot of different products, and so it's able to cross-subsidize and able to plan sort of over the long term. Many of the companies that are trying to develop antibiotics today, that's their only product. So if it doesn't work out for them, they're not going to be able to survive. The other issue is that we've gotten to this dynamic of only believing that something that is new is innovative. And what we have to realize is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that could be just as effective. So GARDP is conducting a public health trial of 3 older antibiotics to develop new combinations for neonatal sepsis. These are generics, they're off patent, they're not commercially interesting, so no pull incentive is ever going to be able to take this forward. It's ultimately going to require push funding, but the benefit could be tremendous. 1 out of every 5 deaths due to AMRs in children and babies, and if we can develop a better treatment for neonatal sepsis, it can have an enormous impact. There are also other older antibiotics that weren't developed or weren't developed for certain indications, again, that a pull incentive will not function for, but could have an enormous public health value. So we need to be able to keep both of these together to ensure that we're being flexible and being able to apply the right solution to the right problem and to the right treatment.
Oh, you wanted to add something?
Well, I think precisely what Thomas Lav, so-called member of the European Parliament, said is very important, that in the pharma package we have the voucher still there. Milestone payment are key. We need to have everything in our toolbox, push and pull funding. We need both. The question is the money at the end of the day, because you can have push, but with little money, you will not achieve anything. You can have a pull incentive mechanism with little money, you will not achieve anything. We tried a pull incentive mechanism last year. We were in discussion with many companies, and we did not succeed because the money was not enough, the conditions were not right. So we need a lot of money. Phase 1 and phase 2, I think that can be funded. But when we come to phase 3, the real hardcore clinical trials, then we are talking about bigger tickets, and that's where it's getting more difficult. So we have also to look at not only be the only one funding, but have a consortium of funders supporting this development. This year we're going to fund both CARB-X and GARDP. So CARB-X for early phase, GARDP for later phase. So trying to have this continuum, but we are coming with little money, and we need much more to tackle the AMR.
Emmanuel, you also have thoughts on this.
Yes, and I would like to go back to cover the topic of the very early development of these antibiotics, because at the end what we've been discussing about is from the moment we have an active compound that needs to go through all the validation phase and the clinical trials. But what I would like to mention is that at the research level, the fundamental research level, and where we develop and we screen new compounds to the very early phase, to preclinical models, this research is mainly funded by grants. And this grant-based system is not adapted for long-term efforts that require massive technological investments. So the way we feed the system that allows to screen all these thousands, millions of drug candidates towards a few lead compounds, this effort should be funded also on a structural way with a more innovative funding mechanism. And this is the only way we can feed the whole pipeline, is to make sure that we have the top-level research labs that are able to do these efforts, which are secured in the investments they make.
Well, a follow-up question for you there from Chris Gray in our audience, who has asked what transformation is needed, if any, or what transformation might be useful on the drug discovery and development side, aside from the new funding models and the commercialization side. Do you see any needs there?
For
any transformation, any approaches needed that might be worked differently on drug discovery and development?
So there are two main aspects that have been changing very recently. One is that when we design these molecules that are potential drug candidates, we now use AI. There's a huge amount of data that is generated by genomic data that constitute of terabytes of information, and then we can use AI to pre-design some candidates, and all these molecules can be create these whole libraries of compounds that we then need to test against libraries of bacteria and biobanks of viruses, and all this requires millions of tests. And for example, in Leuven, that's what we did since the early days of COVID. We have tested 8 million potential compounds for viruses. So to be able to do the research at that level, that size, we need to invest in infrastructure, invest in data analysis, and get together all these people, all these new competencies that have arrived recently in the landscape of drug discovery. And if we can potentiate that, then I'm quite sure that we will be able to feed the pipeline.
Thomas Lav, I'd like to bring you back in again here, because I know you raised the question of some of these funding models, but based on what you've heard here from the colleagues, do you want to develop some thoughts on what really works for us in Europe, and what might be maybe lessons learned from other parts of the world, or methodologies we should continue to stick with? You're muted.
Thank you. There are several things have been said here that I would like to refer to. So first, what Laurent said about stockpiles. Yes, I agree. So there is a voluntary system of solidarity, but we believe that we should have a more structured way, and that we should essentially have a centralized decision-making process in these kinds of cases. You know that this voluntary cooperation can work in some cases, but also we believe that more secure and certain long-term mandatory system should be applied. So this is the direction that we will take on stockpiling and making decision on allocation of medicines. We know that there will be opposition from certain member states, but and of course we are open to different suggestions on how to improve this system. So, for instance, not to create perverse incentives that you do not stockpile because you know you'll get something from other member states, but there are ways how to solve this. But I think in general that a stronger European cooperation, centralized system is needed. So that's the first thing. On the second thing, on the AMR and vouchers, so this is precisely what the parliament did. So the combination of push and pull incentives. Of course, we need also funding for that when we speak about, for instance, milestone payments, but definitely this is something that is needed. And if we say that this is a public health priority, then finding the money in the 7-year budget of the EU should not be such a big problem. If you look at the numbers, how much you're spending on some other things like weapons, I think that for essential public health needs like this one, definitely funding which is several times smaller than what we now plan to invest in weapons. I think several tens of times smaller. Then definitely this is something where we can actually do something, and this is something that we can afford. On the question of funding and research innovation, so first, we have the whole question of the GPL, so all the discussions and negotiations that it took place. Our position in the parliament was clear and in DPP. So let's try to retain the baseline protection, RDP, because we know that we have to stimulate the industry to invest, to develop new medicines. We know that we do not live in a vacuum, that we have to compete with the US. We see that more and more, obviously, in the last months, but also with China. They are gaining foothold in the innovative medicine very strongly. So definitely competing with them also cannot work if we reduce the incentives for regulatory data protection. Of course, it's true that in some of these countries the RDP period is shorter than in Europe, but they have some other competitive advantages that, for instance, much faster timeline for approval of new medicines, etc., etc. So definitely we have some that we can compete with, and that is the regulatory data protection. Of course, what was important for us in these negotiations that we make sure that interests of the generic industry are protected as well. So this is why we said, okay, let's protect the baseline guarantee of RDP so that innovative industry has security and legal certainty so that they can make business plans on basis of that. But on the other hand, let's make sure that generics can already start developing new generic medicines during the time of protection so that they can be put on the market right at the moment when the protection expires, which is especially important for Eastern member states with smaller health budgets, etc., where generic industry plays a much maybe more important part than in some Western member states of the EU, and where the pressure on the budget because of less financial capabilities is bigger. So in that sense, we try to kind of find the right balance between the interests of the generic industry, the interests of the innovative industry, but also the right to access to new medicines, because now we have a situation that 46 out of 48 new ecological medicines newly approved are available in the biggest member state, while in a Baltic member state it's only 3. And also this inequality of access is a big problem in the EU. We still have first and second class citizens, so this is why we also put some provisions on where we impose a duty on the companies to provide the innovative medicine on the market of all 20 member states which make a request within a certain period of time. So because the right of equality of access, when we speak about long-term health and public health consequences for European population, is extremely important. On development of new medicines, so one thing was very important that was said. This also come from academia, and that I think is crucial. And that is that grant system cannot solve all of our problems. So we cannot fund all basic research through grants, which is unfortunately a trend that we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years. So we actually see that in relative terms, compared to inflation, the salaries of researchers are decreasing, the fixed salaries, and more they become dependent on grants. And the whole work in the academia becomes a big fight for grants. There is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability, and I think for basic research this is not good. So I think that we have to, of course, this goes outside of new competences, but I think we have to pay our researchers bigger salaries than we are paying them now. I think we have to provide more structured and systemic long-term funding from the public purse for basic research, because basic research will always be funded from the public purse primarily. And then when we achieve that, then we also have to make sure that our startups and new medicines that we developed are not bought up by foreign competition, like Chinese competition and the American competition, but that we actually scale up these companies, that they develop medicines up to the level of the final approved product. And here we have to think about additional innovative solutions, how to find new private capital to invest. There are a lot of ideas floating around. One of the ideas is that we make rules on pension funds and conditions to invest more flexible, so that we also free up this capital for more risky investments such as this. But the whole idea is that we have to open and utilize the potential of all the capital that we have in the European Union for scaling up of companies and for final development of new medicines, because now we are losing this battle when compared to big pharmaceutical companies from abroad. So a lot of things need to be done, but I think we have to work on all stages, from the basic research to the final commercialization of the product. And I think that by stronger and more systematic public investments, but also more flexible and more innovative rules on stimulating private investments, we can actually make an improvement there as well.
Thank you, Thomas Lav. Let's stay with this question of timeline for approval of new medicines. Hugh, I mean, how big an issue is it? Because we're talking about lessons learned from the pandemic, and one of the things we did learn is that timelines can be sped up when we need to. Tell us a little bit about how that impacts.
It's a huge impact. I mean, it comes back to your patent life for the medicine, and of course that's why Europe is a great place to do business, because the reinforcement of patent laws, so you have that security when you're developing the molecule, but of course you need to get the medicine to the marketplace as quickly as possible for patients and for the healthcare system, but also because of that clock that's running with your patent life as well. So that whole development process needs to be really well thought through. The issues we talked about earlier about the challenges of developing antibiotics are well known, or antivirals as well. The other point, if you think about an antiviral, COVID-19 is a good example. As the virus changes and develops and different variants come through, it's very difficult to actually plan a development program around that. So if you have a COVID-19 product later in that disease process, it's very different from how it was at the beginning of the process. So there needs to be, I think, pragmatic regulatory discussions around that to find ways around that. And you have to have a real good look at your data sets that you can bring to the regulator that really make sense, that are good data sets, but a level of pragmatism around them. And that's another reason I think why EMA is a good example. I think you're able to sit down with the EMA and have those really good discussions about that. And we really welcome that from an industry point of view. One thing, again, about just society in general, and listening to what my colleagues were saying about the range of measures that you need to put in place, I do think overall AMR is a good example where society outside this room tends to take things for granted. I mean, you go into a hospital today, unless you're very unlucky or many comorbid problems, you'll have an operation, you come out, you're probably going to be okay. But we must stay focused on the data that's out there. We know more than 1 million people die per year from AMR today in the world. There was an article in the Lancet last year that estimated in the next 25 years that could be as much as 40 million. And the World Bank estimated that by 2050 AMR could cost world GDP another $1 trillion. So it's a major and growing problem. So all of modern healthcare stands on the shoulders of antibiotics. If you haven't got relevant antibiotics to treat the threats, you've got a major problem on your hands. So everybody needs to join hands together on this one.
Okay, that's alarming, because the general public does not read the Lancet, let's say, for every week. Let's move a little bit to the question also raised by Thomas Lav of access and, if you like, distribution mechanisms. I see also Nakash Hall online asking, do we have data to ascertain which countries are significantly impacted by health security? So I guess, and people within those with lack of access, suggesting some examples: lack of specialists, aging doctors, delayed prescriptions delivery, delayed critical visits, and so on. Rohit, can give us a sense of what sort of a scale access problems are.
Well, I mean, I could speak more to outside of the European Union than within, but this is the central challenge, I think, that eventually the AMR response will have to focus on, hopefully as we start to see more coming into the pipeline, both in the early and the late stage. And the way that GARD-P has tried to think about this is that we're really trying to build now, with governments taking the lead from the ground up, all of the different ingredients that are required. So we need to have more providers in countries that are able to, sort of be able to use new antibiotics effectively. We need to make sure that the antibiotics are available. The African Centers for Disease Control released a study last year that showed only 4 antibiotics represented 2/3 of all prescriptions in the 14 countries they studied. So you're really looking at really severe shortages and scarcity of the antibiotics that are required. And that, of course, is a problem, because if you're using the wrong antibiotic at the wrong time, you're also feeling resistance. We have problems that we don't have the evidence and data that's required to make use of those antibiotics. So one of the important things for GARD-P was for a new antibiotic it is developing with its partner Innoviva, was to run a phase 3 trial in high burden populations in South Africa and Thailand, so that we can actually have the evidence to make use of the antibiotic when it's approved. And then finally, the challenges around registration. And again, I think it's a real credit to Shionogi to be able to work with GARDP and to sign a license agreement to allow GARDP to work then with others to be able to register new antibiotics in the countries where they're required. But if you look at the last 25 years, essentially most antibiotics are not being registered in the countries where they could really have a benefit. And so there's just really no way to be able to get access except through very complicated mechanisms that exist. And then finally, of course, there's just the financing environment today. So, you know, when GARDP is thinking about introducing a new reserve antibiotic into a low-income country, but that country's HIV and TB program could be falling apart today, they're having to make very difficult choices now just in terms of continuing treatment for people who have been on antiretroviral therapy or have a risk or have tuberculosis. They're now facing some very difficult challenges between sort of shoring up their existing health systems as development assistance is falling apart, and then trying to think through issues such as AMR, in which there is a benefit from using new antibiotics and existing antibiotics, but not necessarily the resources and capacity to do that. And so I think that this is really going to be just something that worsens, and then not even mentioning, of course, the debt crisis that many low-income countries are facing today. So they're also just constrained fiscally to be able to make these investments.
Antonio, let me come back to you because, of course, Rohit's talking there specifically about low-income countries, but even within the EU, we have to balance the books. I mean, there are constraints. There is not a limitless money pot to fund everything. And I'm wondering, do we have data about whether different countries or different regions within the EU are struggling with different things, as Nakash suggested, maybe lack of specialists, maybe aging doctors, maybe delayed prescriptions, things that maybe could be solved with resources, but may also equally be solved with better distribution systems or better models?
Well, I think that the answer to this is a complex one. It would certainly require a long-term approach to it. There are differences, but the overall picture is very common. I mean, the estimated lack of health workforce in Europe, it's currently at 1.5 million, if my memory serves me right. And this is going to just going to go worse in the future because a lot of these doctors which are still on the work today are going to retire. I mean, they are aging as our population is aging. So it's not a particularly rose perspective at this stage. Now we need to do a number of things on this, inter alia being aware and also prepare doctors for different type of illnesses in the future, because as the population aging, we will also have to take care of different type of illnesses indeed. We are working with member states. We do have a number of projects there. We are constantly working, but it's not only preparing the member states for what is coming that is necessary. We also have to discuss at a certain point, or member states will have to discuss at a certain point, what are the conditions of employment of a lot of these doctors in the national systems, the difficulties that they have, the capacity to have a normal life. I mean, the country that I know the best, which is Italy, has very serious problems of just salaries for doctors. I mean, they're not paid enough for example, for other type of personnel, care personnel. They're not paid enough to stay in certain positions. So it is a problem. We're working with member states, but it's clear that this is something which can affect very seriously our future in terms of a continued type of care that we have been used to for generations.
Thank you. Laurent, let me ask you a question that's come in from Victor Gomez. Pandemics like COVID, Mpox, and MR have gained a lot of attention, I guess, in the public eye, but he's asking, what about CBRN threats caused by acts of violence, acts or accidents? Is the EU strengthening preparedness and response to these challenges? Is this something on your horizon?
Yes, it's one of our priorities. I think we have, it has been published, a list of priorities in here. The first one is pathogen with high pandemic potential. Second one is AMR, and the third one is CBRN. And for CBRN, as I mentioned before, we have a stockpile of medical countermeasures. These are very niche products. These are products which are quite expensive and that member states do not have because it's low probability but high impact. So they normally don't go for low probability products. So that's where we are coming in a complementary manner. And but in terms of development of new medical countermeasures in the surveillance space, we are not super active, but we have been, for instance, last September, I signed a contract with the European Investment Bank to support the development of a company for product for antitoxin, for terrorist attacks, specific products. So we are operating in that space, not to the extent that the US has been or the Department of Defense of the United States has been doing. So we really need to increase our activities there, and that's why I mentioned before, the defense budget. We need to tap into the defense budget to increase our health security, and in particular for the surveillance threats.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question from the audience briefly before we go to our final round of wrap-up. Andrea Corazza is asking, could the EU orphan drug regulation provide a template to stimulate innovation and reward investments in the antibiotic space? I don't know. Hugh, would you have some thoughts on that, or anyone would like to answer that one?
I'm not sure I'm the best qualified to answer that one.
Antonio, perhaps? Could you perhaps briefly tackle the question of whether the EU orphan drug regulation might stimulate innovation?
Well, we definitely hope so. I mean, that's part of our work. It's then we have to do this in collaboration with, of course, with the companies, and they have to follow on what we're doing. But certainly, often that part of regulation and all the type of pharmaceutical reform that we are putting together is something that is pushing in that direction. May I just, since I have the floor, complement one thing of what Laurent was saying a moment ago on CBRN, which is absolutely correct. Just want to say that we are also strengthening at European level a lot our collaboration with the military personnel. So when we have joint discussion with them on issues like indeed CBRN, things that in the context of the Health Security Committee, things that were absolutely unthinkable, I guess, just even 5 or 6 years ago. So there's also a landscape which is quite changing.
Thank you. Rohit, do you want to come in?
The Orphan Drug Act, there is experience in that the United States actually legislated something known as the GAIN Act over a decade ago, which essentially provides an additional 5 years of exclusivity for new antibiotics. Now, the Orphan Drug Act has additional payments or tax incentives. It's all based on the idea that you would be able to recuperate large returns, essentially, for that extended exclusivity and the tax benefits. That's not what antibiotics are. As we're talking about, antibiotics are things that are almost never going to be commercially attractive. So we're doubling down on a thesis, essentially, that hasn't worked. What does work, and where the European Union deserves a lot of credit, and it's again that from the leadership of HERA, has been trying to say that they have to steer this forward. The Orphan Drug Act says we're just going to re-stimulate the market and it's going to work out for itself. And the GAIN Act, essentially, they've now shown over 10 to 15 years, has had a negligible impact on the development of antibiotics, which is why the United States is thinking about, potentially, at least previous to this year, about new payments that they're going to make for antibiotics. So what the EU is doing is making these larger investments and push funding across the drug development cycle and developing well-targeted pull incentives that reward the companies that are developing new antibiotics that provide a therapeutic benefit in the European Union is what's going to succeed. And again, the evidence has shown all that happened with an Orphan Drug Act or that version in the United States was essentially just getting companies to either make minor modifications to existing treatments or just basically not really changing their trajectory. Because what we've seen, of course, over the last decade, with the exception of companies like Shionogi, is that didn't lead to them to reinvesting into drug development. That actually just continued to have this exodus.
Thank you. So no golden bullet. Not that I expected any easy answers today on this panel. I think I'd like to go for a wrap-up for everyone else. I'll start with our online participants. So Thomas Lav, I guess the question I'm asking is, based on our discussion, how would you design the ideal preparedness program in a nutshell?
Thank you very much. I just wanted maybe shortly to comment on the orphan drugs, because now what was previously in the orphan drugs regulation is now part of the new pharmaceutical package, the regulation that I'm negotiating on. So definitely protecting baseline market exclusivity, protecting the voucher, plus adding additional incentives like milestone payments. That was our idea of how to stimulate research, how to stimulate innovation, especially in orphan drugs, but also antibiotics. In general, I hate this word, but because it's used all the time. But definitely, we need a holistic solution. So we need to stimulate. We need to provide more funding for basic research. We need to provide incentives for companies to develop new medical products, new medicines. We also need to make sure that these companies which develop new products stay in Europe, that they are developed in Europe, and also to stimulate production in Europe to be less dependent on the others, on the sole suppliers and third countries. So I think that now we are going in the right direction with all the incentives in the GPL, also in the CMA, with giving preferential treatment to production in Europe. Also, we've done a lot in terms of coordination already, creation of HERA and all the work that have done, but also strengthening the mandates of ECDC and EMA. And I think we have to do some additional things like this, stronger coordination, mandatory coordination of stockpiling. But I think if we stay on the right track, if we understand that healthcare and public health especially should be one of the priority sectors now in the EU, I think with food production and military industry, these are the three strategic sectors which are most important now in this global competition that we have. And I think if we work on all of these things together, that we can really make a difference, and that Europe can be much better prepared and, for future health crisis, and also much less dependent on imports than it is now.
Thank you. Rather optimistic. So thank you, Thomas Lav. Antonio, a final takeaway from you, and if you like, a sort of an idea how you would build the ideal preparedness program. Antonio, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. No, I was saying that I was certainly not finishing by saying that we are preparing the perfect system, but certainly I think we have improved a lot, as I was saying at the beginning. What I think we should do, well, definitely continue on having a very strong governance and coordination within the EU and within the European institutions, and that's what definitely is been put in place. What is also, I think, important is that we move from reaction to foresight, resilience, and anticipation. Of course, this we were discussing a moment ago includes working on capacity building on the health workforce, but also means to have a sustainable and predictable financing, a promotion of interoperability across sectors and borders. So we have the basic system in place. We have a way that we are designed to go further. So what we need now is to implement. And of course, in this sense, I think we will have to continue considering that a good financing for this type of assistance and work will remain important in the future.
Thank you very much. Laurent, a takeaway from you. What would you like people to remember as they're leaving today?
Remember. Okay, big question. Well, I think Antonio and Thomas Lav have said a lot of important things. Well, funding is the key if you want to get new medical countermeasures, where antibiotics or therapeutics or vaccine. That's in French we say nerf de la guerre. That's really the key, and it's going to be important that health figure prominently under the next MFF. So we count on the European Parliament to help us, on the Council and Member States, to make sure that we have sufficient budget to do what we're supposed to do. The second thing is Europe should not fund everything, and I think it's a call for all of the funders to to come into the game. It's always the same players. It's Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust are always there. It was before BARDA, it's HERA, it's a bit of other players, but it's always the same. It's time for others to put money. I'm looking at, for instance, Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia made a nice ministerial meeting on AMR in Jeddah last November. Where is the money from Saudi Arabia? Where is the funding? So this is a global issue, and we are not the only one who have high GDP per capita. There are some others. So it's really a global, worldwide issue, and others need also to play their game, their part of the game.
If I had €1 for every time someone said, where is the money in this room, on this stage, I would have it. So, Emmanuel, what's is funding your key takeaway, or is there something else?
No, I'll try to bring something else, even if it is, of course, massively important, but it has been discussed. What I would like to insist on is that these public health emergencies and emerging pathogens, they usually emerge where there's poverty, political unrest, all these partners with whom we don't have our traditional diplomatical channels in place and economical channels in place. And so I would insist on the fact that the global health diplomacy is, including with partners which are not our traditional partners, needs to be put in place and secured. We need to be aware of what other scientists and medical doctors observe around the world. We need to be informed. We need to create these channels, and that layer of diplomacy needs to be strengthened. We are strong, at least we work to be strong inside Europe. I think all these efforts are very good, go in the right direction, but we also need to be strong in our ability to go beyond our borders and track pathogens where they emerge, and this is going to be a big challenge.
Thank you. Well said. Rohit?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with the remarks that were just made by both. GARDP is built on the idea of international cooperation and partnership. So we have 9 or 10 governments funding the organization, a couple of large foundations, and some non-governmental organizations. And that is, I think, the beauty of it is that as we can bring more governments into funding GARDP and working towards common goals and defined objectives, that ultimately is the way in which we can actually ensure that other countries are, as I think Laurent's rightly putting forward the funding that's required in order to achieve these objectives. And to get out of this idea that we're in a zero-sum game. I mean, it is out of fashion today to say that, but that should be our biggest lesson from COVID-19. It was this zero-sum lack of cooperation, and it's only going to be by building structures and investing in these structures that we're going to be able to overcome that, and to be able to do that at the time at which we are not going to see this intensification of competition. The other is just going to be not to leave this to the market. It really does require the EU to be able to have that directed hand and to be able to say that they are going to be able to steward and to be able to manage what is required, what the priorities are, and how it should be developed in order to get what people need. I think this idea that, ultimately, if we just simply put a lot of funding forward and we're going to get what we want is not what the last 30 years have shown us, and I don't think the next 30 years will turn out the right way if we simply rely upon that.
And Hugh, the mixed blessing of speaking last.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that. I would direct everyone to the 100-day mission. I think that's an excellent strategic framework. There's a lot that has to be done in it. We've said it all already today. Excellent R&D pipelines through funding and investment, attracting more people back to the space, great funding mechanisms, working together, working as partners, and getting to places in the world that you might not be able to get to yourself through great partnerships such as us with GARDP, right? We're experts in the developed world, but GARDP are excellent, experts in the low and middle income world, and it's important for us, all stakeholders, to bring innovation to all the patients across the world that need it. So access to medicines is key.
Thank you, and that is a great point to wrap up on. Thank you all very much. Thank you for our online speakers as well. Thank you to you, the audience, for joining us in person and online, and for all your great questions. And of course, thank you to Shinogi for supporting. And Euractiv events will, of course, be continuing, and you can find out more by going to events.euractiv.com, and you continue the conversation on social media if you wish, using the hashtag EADebates. That's it for today. Have a lovely evening.